Okay, so now we're going to project even a little more into the future. And I'd like to invite up our next speaker who joins us, Melissa Ceruolo, who's the Vice President of Biomarker Analytics, also coming from our Sensor Cloud department at Medidata. And she'll be talking to us about how we're going to take some of the real world data and how we can actually get it to inform and transform our models to make them more realistic. Melissa? Thank you.
All right, thank you so much for the introduction and for inviting me here today. My background is actually in mechanical engineering, so it's been really great to hear from the previous speakers. I'm not working as a mechanical engineer today. I am working in software engineering and data science, and specifically I'm focused on sensors and primarily wearables. So I'm going to introduce to you Medidata Sensor Cloud, which is part of Medidata's Patient Cloud. It is the component of the clinical trial software that interfaces most closely with the patient. And so back in 2020, Medidata acquired a company called MC10. MC10 is where I started my medical device development. We commercialized a product called the BioStamp system. It looks like a Band-Aid. It's very thin and flexible, and it has a lot of sensors, gyroscope, accelerometer, electrodes to measure ECG, as well as electromyography if you put it on a muscle. Medidata was very interested in the technology and expanding their portfolio in sensors and also expertise in signal processing. So for the past 2 years, I've been here at Medidata building out a platform that supports ingestion of sensor data, not just from the device that I just described, but from all of devices, medical grade devices, also some consumer grade devices we're evaluating as well. So we have a portfolio of partners, various types of devices that range from wrist-worn, chest-mounted sensors, spirometers, glucometers. So really, the whole boom in wearables and even not wearables, some of the kind of passive monitoring types of devices. So that's really in the wheelhouse that I'm going to be speaking about today. So what does Sensor Cloud do? First, we have an integration with the variety of device partners that I just described. That could be done in a variety of ways, cloud-to-cloud integration or at the SDK layer. That data all comes into the Medidata Clinical Cloud. And Medidata, as many of you may know, is really well known for the RAVE platform, which is EDC, electronic data capture. This is the clinical data that is traditionally captured in a study, in a clinical research study, that includes labs, ePro, which is patient-reported outcomes, hospitalizations, all of the EMR, EHR type of data that's traditionally collected. We now have this new data stream, which is sensors, and sensor data looks very different than traditional EHR and EMR data because it's high fidelity, high frequency. Some of the sensors that we're using, the sampling rates are above 1,000 hertz. So this type of data it needs to be treated differently, right? It's not just a data point when you come into the clinic and you have your vitals checked, right? That's an episodic data point. This is continuous longitudinal data. And when I say longitudinal data, I don't mean that we're monitoring patients for 6 months, 1 year continuously. That's not what we recommend, although some studies do that type of longitudinal monitoring. But when we think about longitudinal monitoring, it's the patient comes into the clinic, they have their regular scheduled in-clinic visit with the data collection that happens. That data is collected into the EDC, and then there's a sensor that is paired with that study that's specifically designed to be fit for purpose for the data that's needed and required for the study to collect the outcome. And that patient could either stay in the clinic to do additional assessments or go home and have, let's say, a week of remote patient monitoring. And really, that's our sweet spot. So looking at 1 to 2 weeks worth of data per phase of a study. And what we're looking at is changes over time. So we're baselining patients with their physiological signals. So their accelerometer, you're using accelerometer to look at their motion, their movement, their behavior in the home. We're looking at all of their vitals that we can collect continuously from the monitoring systems. And we're bringing all of that into our platform and applying models, signal processing, and aggregation so that we can interpret what's going on with the patient in the home. So how are we using all of this? Many of you may have heard of digital biomarkers. So one of the things that we're trying to do is we're trying to build evidence that the physiological data that's collected objectively at the patient level is as equivalent, or better than some of the traditional clinical outcome measures. And I'll give you an example. So in Huntington's, there's a clinician-reported outcome called the UHDRS, which essentially looks at the patient and how are they standing, how are they walking, and it rates their chorea, which is the jerkiness of their movement, on a scale of 0 to 5. Parkinson's has a similar type scale, the UPDRS, where the patient's asked to do a series of tasks like touching their nose, opening, closing their fists. And again, it's a subjective score that the clinician provides. So all of that can be measured with a sensor, right? We can put a sensor on the wrist or on the arm, and we're able to measure tremor and movement as a patient is doing a certain task. We put sensors on the torso, and we're able to measure and have a quantitative measurement of chorea, which is the jerkiness of movement or postural sway. So we're looking at how the objective measures that we're deriving from the sensor data is equivalent or correlated with the clinical outcome measures. And the results that we have and what we published on so far are really, really promising. And we're hoping that, we're still very early, and we know we're taking all of this with our partners and our sponsors to the regulatory bodies. But over time, with the evidence that we need, we're hoping that we can really transform the clinical research industry to look at these novel measures and really think about kind of reducing the amount of patients in trials, reducing the amount of time patients spend in the clinic, because we're getting more accurate, more precise measurements using sensors. We're not doing this alone. We have a network of partners that we're working with across the space. We have great academic collaborators. We have CROs, which are clinical research organizations that run studies, and we have a network of sponsors and device partners. And so this is really a collaborative approach. Other teams that are working on new digital biomarkers are working in the consortiums, and really that's how we're going to be transforming the industry and working with regulatory and providing the evidence along with their guidance in order to kind of flip the switch and really think about sensors as not only exploratory measurement, but a secondary or even a primary measurement outcome in clinical research. So I wanted to give you an example of one really exciting program that we're working on. This is an example of a digital biomarker program. This work is being funded currently by a CRO LabCorp, and we have several collaborators that are shown up there: University of Rochester Medical Center, University of Arizona, as well as the University of Vermont. And we have several device partners that we're working with. The one up there is VitalConnect. VitalConnect is an ECG disposable monitor that collects continuous ECG as well as accelerometer data over 7 days of wear, and then the patient can remove it and throw it out. So our focus for this particular program is in heart failure and pulmonary hypertension. I see the dots starting to connect with some of the other presentations around the physical model, but what we're looking at is the electrophysical model, looking at the real-time ambulatory ECG. So when we ask the patients to do a functional assessment test. So traditionally, that's in the form of a 6-minute walk test. So patients come into the clinic, they have a course, and there's someone that is timing and counting their laps. The patient is instructed to walk as quickly as they can for 6 minutes, and the outcome measure is distance. So how far did the patient walk in those 6 minutes? That's it. We can do better. If you put one of these VitalConnect patches on the chest, what do you get? You get your real-time ECG. You get your heart rate acceleration, your heart rate deceleration. You get your max heart rate, cardiac effort. Also with accelerometer, which is really interesting. We're able to see how the patients are moving along those 6 minutes. How are they approaching the turns? Where do they get fatigued throughout the test? So it's a simple thing of adding just one component to this assessment, and you get a whole array of metrics, and that's what I'm showing here under the sensor cloud capability. So we're able to compute distance. We're using features of the accelerometer to look at mean amplitude deviation, and the steps, cadence, walking speed, and all of that is included. Now what we're doing is we understand that we're able to do this in the clinic. Let's take it to the home, right? Let's ask the patients to wear the sensors home and do 1 to 2 walks over the next 2 days. And not only are we collecting the data during those walks, but we're also passively collecting their sleep data, their activity and vitals just throughout the day as they're going on their normal routine. This is a huge data set. Our target is 200 patients. We've reached almost 100 patients. The study will go on for the next 2 years. We're following the patients for a year. So that means we're able to look at their change in clinical outcome or any changes to therapy, any hospitalizations, all of the contextual data that we need in order to see if we can use these sensor-derived metrics to be able to predict an outcome, right? This is an observational study, so there's no sponsor right now involved. There's no pharma company involved. So all of the patients are on different therapies and are at different stages of their treatment or of their disease. But we're starting to publish. We just presented at American Thoracic Society, and this is kind of a novel program for Medidata, certainly, and the appetite for what we're actually doing here, I think, is quite a big opportunity. Okay, I mentioned this. We have deep expertise in sensor data science. What does that mean? That means that we can take all of the raw data that's collected from the hardware, the accelerometer, the gyroscope, the electrodes, the analog front ends, all of that data is coming in, and we want the raw data, right? Because in order to build the models, you want to be able to do that feature extraction. So not only do we have the capability to do all of this in-house and the expertise, but Medidata also has the platform, the cloud-based platform where you can store the data, where you can access the data. We're using Lakehouse layers and Amazon Glue and having an infrastructure to support this because it's not easy. And not a lot of companies are able to do this. But if you think of Medidata as the warehouse for all of this data coming in, and the benefit here is that we can align the sensor data with imaging, with ePro data, with EMR data. And that's how we're designing this data science platform. We have several algorithms that we've either developed in-house or in-license from our academic partner. Those include, from an accelerometer standpoint and a movement science standpoint, things like specific measures around gait asymmetry, posture, postural sway, activity complexity. So when you think of, maybe you might have a wearable today, an Apple Watch or a Fitbit, and you think of, step count. Okay, so we're going far, far beyond just the amount of steps. So that's the quantity of movement, but we're looking at the quality of movement. It's not just how many steps you took, it's how did you take those steps? How did you go from a sit to a stand? How did you do a timed up and go where you walk from point A to point B? That's what we can start to look at in the sensor data and start to really understand, and we can start to tease apart cohorts and cluster patients based on their physiological data, based on their accelerometer data. We can see who's healthy, who has chorea, who has Parkinson's, who has heart failure. It's very interesting, and I didn't get that data ready, but now for next time, I certainly will have more data to show you. Okay, so what is our focus areas? Because the biomarker space and the types of algorithms that we can develop is very, very broad. There's a lot of different lenses and therapeutic areas we can focus in. And many of our partners are focusing in really interesting things like scratch. I was just on a panel with someone from Cybele Health, another physical monitoring patch, and they're focused on how to detect scratch and itch for atopic dermatitis. So we have decided to focus on three main pillars. The first is quality of life, and I'll double click on that in a moment. The middle is functional capacity, is what I just spoke about, which is the 6-minute walk test and the heart failure and pulmonary hypertension study, where we're really looking at how to use functional capacity and what we're collecting in the home to predict outcome. And then the third is movement profiling, and this is where we have the most, I would say, expertise and history. We have over 300,000 hours of patient data in CNS. That includes Huntington's, Parkinson's, and multiple sclerosis. And so saying that, you can see how the two green boxes on the bottom are enabled, right? So now that we are landing on this, we have all of this data, we can start developing virtual twin models. We can start looking at how to create healthy controls based on the data set that we've been collecting and the years that we have collecting this data from the human body. And what was mentioned previously around what we're doing at Medidata AI with the synthetic controls, well, we've been talking about let's add the sensor signal as just another row, right? Another series of metrics in order to build that synthetic control. Okay, I'll spend a few minutes on quality of life. Okay, so in clinical research, quality of life is something that all studies want to be able to measure, and the regulatory bodies are really emphasizing the need to be able to not just improve mortality, but you need to improve the quality of a person's life, and that's hard, right? What is quality of life? This is a definition that I came to after doing some research with and talking to stakeholders on how to define quality of life, an individual's perception of their health, their comfort, and happiness. So what tools are we using to measure quality of life? And there are standard instruments that we're using today, things called the EQ5D, the SF36, the PSQI. So these are all instruments that have a list of questions that ask you about how did you sleep the past 30 days? What was your average number of hours sleep? Were you interrupted during your sleep? Are you able to do your daily tasks? How do you feel mentally and emotionally? And so there's all different dimensions. And so what we did is we took a landscape view of all of these different surveys, probably looked at about a dozen of them that are traditionally used in quality of life. And we said, okay, which one of these questions are we able to get at objectively from the sensor data, right? Because, okay, how are you moving throughout the day? How many hours of sleep? We can model that. We have algorithms that are able to give us metrics around duration of sleep, sleep onset, sleep efficiency, and so forth. So what we did is we actually developed a sensor-driven quality of life methodology or framework where we have the objective, the physical activity, sleep quality, and vital signs as the three dimensions for the sensor-driven measurements. So here what you're seeing is that we have the traditional subjective patient-reported outcomes in conjunction with the sensor-driven outcomes, which we believe gives you a total view of the patient, a real holistic view of what's really going on in quality of life. And so this is just a kind of a concept chart here, but we've actually built the algorithm and we're starting to aggregate and roll all of this up so that we can have a total, let's call it Medidata quality of life or Dassault quality of life measurement that includes both the sensor data as well as the standard instruments. Okay, I think I have just a few seconds left, so I'll leave with just this exciting new work that Steve and I have recently been discussing. So, our idea here is that we can complement what we're doing with the living heart model and the living heart system with physiological monitoring. And this can be a closed feedback loop where you take a snapshot of the heart, there's some intervention, we monitor the patients over some prescribed period of time, and we use that data to then go and feed back into the model. And here we're able to dynamically see what's going on with their cardiac performance. So this is really exciting work, and I'm really happy to be here today and hope for this synergy over the next couple months. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Melissa. So I think we have time for a question or two from the audience, if we have. Do we have one here?
Yes. I think Professor Kuhn said earlier that we need good data, not always a lot of data. And so I was curious about how do you deal with the quality of the data of your sensors, considering that you don't own the sensors per se, and we can get a lot of noisy data.
It's a great question. We have cleaning rules. So first, we absolutely need to address that because there's a lot of noise. You're dealing with patient compliance. You're dealing with sensors that may have broke or failures. So we have established, because we've been looking at sensor data for many, many years, a set of cleaning rules. So we know, was a sensor placed on the wrong part of the body? Is the sensor supposed to be placed on the chest, but we're not getting an ECG? So is it just placed on the table? So we've already identified a lot of the gotchas, and that is part of the pre-processing. So before we even get to the algorithm, we're going to do that cleaning step. But that's an area that is, we're still working on. So great question.
I should point out that Carlos is from a wearables company, so you should see him afterwards. Oh.
You showed a lot of data over here. Owen Richfield, same guy that's been asking questions the whole day. I wanted to ask, so a lot of the data that you've shown came from one sensor. Perhaps all of the data that you showed came from one sensor. Are you looking at other sensors? And then can you talk about interoperability between those sensors?
Yeah, no, we're actually looking at a variety of sensors. I didn't put the slide up there, but we're looking at Actigraph, Vital Connect. We're using Biostamp. We're using Cybel Health. We're using Empatica, Nuvo Air, Gluco. So we have a lot. I wouldn't say like 50, but maybe a dozen to 20 or so partners where we're ingesting their sensor data and aligning it. One thing that we are working on is device agnostic algorithms, right? So we don't want to be tied to a single device, because we know, just based on my experience with Biostamp, that, there's, things happen in the industry, and you need to be able to adapt and use different technologies because things are changing so fast on the component level. So we are working on, kind of validation paths so that we can have a suite of devices that are going to be compatible with our algorithms.
Melissa, great presentation, thank you. I have a question for you. Based on all what you showed us, what does it take for pharma companies to use digital biomarkers as a primary endpoint for a trial?
So evidence. I think evidence we really need, and if we want to champion that, we need to be talking to them and really leading the conversation. But we need to publish, we need to do the studies and do the diligence. I think it's not if, but when. I think it's just a matter of time where they're going to see that this is a reduction in cost, reduction of patient volume. This is just a better way, right? And I think eventually there'll be a conversion there. We're at the beginning, right? It's still very slow, and there's not that many or any primary endpoints using sensor data, right? They're mostly all exploratory. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't continue to work on it. Yes.
Well, with that, in fact, that's a perfect transition. In fact, earlier we heard to that point, we heard when I asked Brent Craven from the FDA to share some of his observations, he pointed out that it was, in fact, the fact that endpoints and what we measure are not connected. And that's one of our biggest gaps to close. And that's what Melissa and her team are trying to do. So please join me in thanking Melissa once again.